Good morning. The topic today is about Kohanim visiting the graves of Tzadikim, righteous people. By no means is this going to be an exhaustive presentation of the whole topic, but it will be a just introduction, obviously the primary classic sources that are relevant to the topic, and a little bit of the discussion, the surrounding discussion. So, there is in Gemara in Kesubas, Taf Kuf Gimel Amud Beis, 103b, where it quotes Rav Chia as saying, "Oisei hayoim shemeis Rabbi batla kedusha." On that day that Rabbi died, holiness, kedusha was batla, was ceased. Now, the context of the Gemara is trying to determine who passed away first, Rabbi or Rabbi Chia. So, if we have a statement from Rabbi Chia about Rabbi passing away, so then that would indicate that Rabbi passed away first. And then the Gemara says that if you hold that there's possible, you have to say it the other way around. But in other words, it is possible that Rabbi Chia passed away first, and that it's Rabbi saying about Rabbi Chia that on that day that Rabbi Chia died, kedusha was ceased. So what does it mean that kedusha ceased? So Tosfos says on that Gemara, brings two perushim onto two interpretations to what this means. First interpretation is just like we have at the end of Soiter, where it says when this one died, this characteristic ceased, and when this one died, then another characteristic. We've spoken about this a number of times. When Rabbi Yosef died, humility ceased. When Rabbi Yosef says, "Don't say humility because I'm humble." Yeah, we spoke about that. So the first interpretation on Tosfos is that when we say kedusha ceased, we mean that the same thing is what it says in the end of Soiter, that when Rabbi died, Anova and Yira ceased, humility and fear of Yira Shamayim, fear of heaven, and these are sort of generically included in the word kedusha, holiness. Rabbi was holy, so it's kind of synonymous. However, there is also a linguistic difference between the way it says it in the end of Soiter and the way it says it here in Ksubas, and that is in the end of Soiter, the Mishnah says when so and so died, from the time that so and so died. From the time that Rabbi died, Anova and Yira ceased. Okay, here it doesn't say from the time that Rabbi died. It says on the day that he died, it ceased. It's kind of, this is something that happened on that day, and maybe didn't repeat itself. So Tosfos therefore brings another interpretation in the name of Reb Chaim Kohen. Reb Chaim Kohen is one of the Baalei Tosfos, who's quoted in our Tosfos a number of times, and he was, not surprisingly, a Kohen. That was his name, Reb Chaim Kohen, right? And he said that if he had been around when Rabbeinu Tam passed away, he would have come in contact with Rabbeinu Tam's. He would have gone to the Levaya, I guess, gone to the funeral, and become Tameh from Rabbeinu Tam. What it means when it says that when Rabbi died, Kedusha ceased, it means the sanctity of Kahuna is paused. Meaning, the Kohen is holy, and that holiness dictates that he's not allowed to come in contact with a dead body. And when Rabbi died, that was paused because it's okay for a Kohen to come in contact with the body of Rabbi. And that's why it says, not like it says in Soiter, from when Rabbi died, this and this ceased, but on that day, on the day of the funeral of Rabbi, Kedusha, meaning the sanctity of the Kohen, was on pause. And this is explicitly backed up by the Yerushalmi, which says clearly that when Rabbi died, there was a ruling put out that there's no kahuna today, right? So everybody should attend the funeral. Okay, but Reb Chaim HaKohen's Pirush, Tosfos says it's not so clear that could be acceptable. It could be the Yerushalmi is only talking about the rabbinic type of prohibition. In other words, there's coming in contact with the corpse in a direct way, which is biblically forbidden, and then there's Beis HaPras, which means you literally Beis HaPras means a field where there may have been a grave plowed in, so there's a possibility of being coming in contact. But the point is that it's a rabbinic prohibition for a kohen to go into Beis HaPras, and only that would be permissible. But a regular Tumah D'Oraisa, we would not allow a kohen to do. So basically, what we have here is Reb Chaim HaKohen being quoted is saying that the prohibition for a kohen to come in contact with a dead body was suspended when Rabbi died, and Reb Chaim HaKohen is saying that he would have extended the same suspension to Rabbeinu Tam. And then Tosfos is saying, however, I'm not so sure we could accept Reb Chaim HaKohen's understanding. It could be that even according to the Yerushalmi, we would only say that a rabbinic type of contamination would be permissible for a kohen when it came to Rabbi's funeral, but not a biblical type of coming in contact with the body. Okay. Now, essentially, we could come away here, and we're going to see different sources that indicate different things over here. But let's just put out on the table straight away the three possible options of what we could come away with from this Tosfos. Option number one is, like Tosfos sort of comebacks, no, this is a mistake. There's no allowance to come in contact with a dead body for a tzaddik, for a funeral, unless maybe it's a rabbinic type of contamination, maybe then we would allow it. But the typical of carrying the coffin or coming within 4 amos, within 6 feet of the coffin or anything like that, or being under the same roof as the body, all of that would be completely forbidden. Then there's the approach of Reb Chaim Kohen that says it's permissible, but within the approach of Reb Chaim Kohen we could divide that into two. One approach is to say that it would have been permissible for him to attend the funeral, for whatever reason, we'll see soon why that would be, to attend the funeral. And the other more expansive way is to say that it's nothing to do with the funeral per se, it's the fact that the body of a tzaddik does not impart tumah, and it's not just for the funeral. If he wants to, for whatever reason, go and visit the grave at a later at any other time, as long as he's not coming in contact with the graves of the people buried around him. But if you have a way that you're only coming in contact with the grave of that tzaddik, that would be okay. That would be the most extreme way to read Reb Chaim Kohen, and we're going to see that all of these three approaches exist in the various Sfarim. Now, there's another point over here. Okay, we'll get to that point soon. Let's move on to the next Gemara. So there's another Gemara in Bava Metzia, which is the whole story about how Rabbi Bar Chana met Eliyahu Hanavi in a cemetery, and he asked him a question there which was relevant to this Gemara in Bava Metzia, and then the conversation continues where Rabbi Bar Chana says, I think it's Rabbi Bar Chana, it's in Bava Metzia Daf Kuf Yudalid Amud Beis 114b, and Rabbi Bar Chana says to Eliyahu Hanavi, hold on a second, Lav Kohen Omar, my time of Kohen Ma'abe Beis HaKoros, aren't you Eliyahu Hanavi a Kohen? Right? Because Eliyahu Hanavi is Pinchas is a Kohen, right? So, aren't you a Kohen? How could you be hanging around in a cemetery? This doesn't seem to be a good place for a Kohen. Amalei, lemasni marta. Lemasni marta. So Eliyahu Hanavi said back to him, have you not learnt the laws of Taharos? Don't you know that Reb Shimon ben Yochai said that the graves of non-Jews don't impart Tumah? This was a non-Jewish cemetery. A Kohen is allowed to hang out in a non-Jewish cemetery. Okay, that's one story of Eliyahu Hanavi coming in contact with a dead body. Now, there's another story which is brought in the Medrash, in Yalkut Shemoni HaMishlei. It could be it's another Midrashim also. This is the story. We know that Rabbi Akiva was killed by the Romans. He was one of the Asarei Gemalchus. Says the Medrash Azoi, "Mai saw you, but Rabbi Akiva. There was a story with Rabbi Akiva. He was incarcerated in prison. Rabbi Shua Agarsi was with him in the prison, and he was taking care of his needs. Erev Yom Kippur nifta mimenu v'halach lebeisai. On Erev Yom Kippur, Rabbi Shua left the prison and he went home for Yom Kippur. Bo Eliyahu also Eliyahu Hanavi came v'amad al Pesach beisai and stood at the entrance to the house of Rabbi Shua Agarsi. Amalei shalom alecha Rabbi. Amalei shalom alecha Rabbi Meiri. He greeted him and he greeted him back. Amalei klum atatzarich amalei miyata. So Rabbi Shua Agassi, so Eliyahu Hanavi says, what do you need? Do you need anything? And he says, so Rabbi Shua Agassi says, who are you? Amalei, so Eliyahu Hanavi said to Rabbi Shua Agassi, Kohen ani, I'm a Kohen. Uvasi lahagid lecha, and I came to tell you, Rabbi Akiva meis beveis ha'asurim, that Rabbi Akiva died in the jail. So it seems like the story with the Romans killing Rabbi Akiva must have happened on Erev Yom Kippur, if you put the two stories together. Okay. So both of them immediately, Rabbi Eliyahu Hanavi together with Rabbi Shua Agassi, go back to the jail. They found the entrance to the jail open. And the guard was sleeping. And all the prisoners were sleeping. They placed Rabbi Akiva on the stretcher, and they took him out. Immediately Eliyahu Hanavi joined in the efforts and took Rabbi Akiva on his shoulders. When Rabbi Shua saw Eliyahu Hanavi holding the body of Rabbi Akiva, hold on, says Rabbi Shua Agassi to Eliyahu. 1 second, didn't you just tell me that you're a Kohen? A Kohen is not allowed to hold a dead body. Eliyahu Hanavi says to Rabbi Yeshua, Chas v'shalom, God forbid, there is no tumah, there's no impurity in the Torah scholars and even in their students. They were carrying Rabbi Akiva's body the whole night until they came to this location. They came and the cave opened up and they saw a chair and a bench and a lamp. They buried him there, and Eliyahu Hanavi finished it off by saying how Ashreichem Tzadikim, how fortunate Rabbi Akiva is to have this type of burial. The point is, we see here that Eliyahu Hanavi, who was a Kohen, was found in the cemetery with the non-Jews. That's the Gemara in Bava Metzia, and he said that it's not a problem because non-Jews don't impart tumah. And also, he was found, he preoccupied himself with the burial of Rabbi Akiva, and he said that that's because Tzadikim don't impart tumah. So, and the Gemara in Yevamos, the Gemara in Bava Metzia also, but I'm just going to quote from Yevamos. There's a discussion there about whether or not the different opinions exactly as to whether non-Jews impart tumah, non-Jewish corpse imparts tumah. And Tosis over there says, "Va'imeri the ein halacha k'Reb Shimon." The halacha does not follow Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Reb Shimon ben Yochai says in the Gemara in Bava Metzia, we said before, that Reb Shimon ben Yochai says that the graves of non-Jews do not impart tumah. Says Tosis, no, that's not the halacha. The halacha is that the graves of non-Jews
do impart
tumah. The Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, because Reb Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees with Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Ketanam Masechtas Olis, as we find in another Mishnah in Olis. And therefore, says Tosis, Kohanim have to be careful to avoid coming too close to the graves, to Gentile cemeteries. You have a parak on Makabel Buvda Lidol the Heshav the Rabbi Avu Kabshim Ben Yechoidacha. We saw the Gemara in Bava Metzia where Eliyahu Hanavi explicitly relies on this opinion of Reb Shimon ben Yochai to go to the cemetery of the Gentiles. So how could I Tosis say that the halacha is that Kohanim have to avoid graves of Gentiles and we don't follow Reb Shimon ben Yochai? We see clearly that Eliyahu Hanavi did follow him. And Ma'aser Rav, whenever you have a record of somebody actually following this opinion in practice, then that certainly carries halachic weight. Eliyahu Hanavi did this in practice. He went he was hanging out in the non-Jewish cemetery. Says Tosis the Chuya Kamatchila. Eliyahu Hanavi didn't really mean that the grave of Gentile don't impart tumah. He was just sort of giving him, how do you say the Chuya Kamatchila? He was giving him, there's probably a good English expression for this, but the point is, he was sort of giving him an answer to get him off his back without getting into the details. And the main reason why Eliyahu Hanavi did indeed go to the non-Jewish cemetery was not because the grave is non-Jew are not a problem, but it's because most coffins have a Pesach Tefach. That means that most coffins have a space between the corpse and the lid of the coffin. There is a space of a Tefach. And so, without getting into all the ins and outs of the laws of Tumah and Tara, but the idea is that space causes the tumah. Those who learn Rambam have come across this. Yes, you remember this from Rabbi Gordon, the Rabbi Gordon app, right? If there's a certain space, then that contains the tumah, and therefore the tumah wouldn't extend out of the kever, and that would have been permissible for Eliyahu Navi to come in contact with it, with the thing. There's actually, I recently saw a video of some street in Israel leading into Beit Shemesh, where there's literally a pipe coming out of the ground, and sort of just a pipe coming out of the ground and then going to the right, and that's it. And basically, apparently, they found those graves underneath that section in the road, and in order to allow for Kohanim to walk up and down that street, they orchestrated this thing with a space and a pipe, and again, without getting into all the laws of exactly how it works, but it's just interesting, just a pipe coming out of the ground, and it's in order for Kohanim to be allowed to walk down that street. Anyway, so Akbanim, the point is, Tosfos is saying that actually graves of non-Jews do impart tumah, and Eliyahu Navi had a different reason to be allowed to be in the cemetery of the non-Jew, and the fact that he told Rabbi Bachana that non-Jews don't impart tumah, that was just, he didn't really mean it. And we find that Eliyahu Navi was in the habit of giving these sort of off-the-cuff answers, even though they're not 100% accurate. As we find similarly in the story in the Medrash, that when Eliyahu Navi was burying Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Yeshua said to Eliyahu Navi, "Aren't you a kohen? How could you be holding the body of Rabbi Akiva?" And Eliyahu Navi said to him, "Oh, that's because tzadikim don't impart tumah." But that's not true. It's not true that tzadikim don't impart tumah. The reason why Eliyahu Navi was allowed to preoccupy himself with Rabbi Akiva's body, mitzvah. Rabbi Akiva was a meis mitzvah. A meis mitzvah means where you have a corpse, a person who's passed, who there's no one to his body is neglected. There isn't the Chevra Kadisha. There aren't people around to tend to the needs of his burial. So in that case, a Kohen is allowed to come in contact with the dead body, and that's why Rabbi Eliyahu Navi came in contact with Rabbi Akiva, because two more words. Because Rabbi Akiva was killed by the Romans, and people were afraid to go in and bury him, and that's why you needed to have this whole miraculous intervention of Eliyahu Navi breaking into the jail and the guards falling asleep and all the prisoners falling asleep, and that's why he was able to do so. Yes.
And weren't there more people with him than just?
It was him and Yeshua Agassi, but I guess you need two people.
Right. Okay.
I think the word you were looking for earlier was flippant. Like when you're...
Yeah, okay, that's...
Like say something to just kind of brush somebody off.
Exactly, yeah, okay, that could be a word, flippantly. Now, on this Tosfos in the Yavamis, there's a Narach L'ner, and he says, no, maybe, why are you saying that Eliyahu Navi was being flippant? Maybe he means literally that tzadikim don't impart tumah. As we see from the Gemara in Ksubis that we started off with today, that on the day that Rabbi died, Kedusha ceased, and Chaim Kohen says, I would have gone to the funeral of Rabbeinu Tam. Says the Aruch Laneh, this Tosfos over here that says that he was being flippant is in accordance with the second opinion in that Tosfos, which disagrees with Chaim HaKohen, right? So all of this is coming together now. We have two opinions. We have the opinion of Reb Chaim Kohen, who he holds that tzadikim don't impart tumah. It doesn't say so explicitly about all tzadikim. He says about Rabbi and Rabbeinu Tam, but let's extend that to all tzadikim. And according to him, Eliyahu Navi is not being flippant. Eliyahu Navi is saying the truth. He's saying, the reason I'm allowed to bury Rabbi Akiva is because he's a tzaddik. And then there's the other approach in Tosfos, which says, no, you cannot, there's no basis for a Kohen to touch or to come in contact with the corpse of a tzaddik, and the reason why Eliyahu Navi buried Rabbi Akiva is because he was a mas mitzvah. Now, why would it be that, what would be sort of the logic to suggest that a tzaddik does not impart tumah? Like, why should the fact, right? So we have to understand a little bit, what does tumah mean? Why does a corpse impart tumah, and why would a tzaddik be an exception to that rule? So there's obviously many Sfarim that talk about it, but I'm going to read to you two quotes. One is from Rabbeinu Bechaya. Rabbeinu Bechaya's introduction to Parshas Emer, which is where the prohibition of Kohanim to come in contact with the dead appears. And the and by the way, I don't think I printed for myself here the quote, but I believe that in the Ramban... Oh yeah, no, I did have the quote. I'm going to have the quote soon. There's a similar quote from the Ramban. the Ramban, I don't know if the Ramban goes into the details of the reason why, but the Ramban clearly is of the opinion that tzaddikim do not impart tumah, and that matches up with Rabbeinu Bechaya, because Rabbeinu Bechaya, it comes from the school of the Ramban. But, you know what, before I read you Rabbeinu Bechaya, let me read you an important line from the Ramban. And then I'm also going to read you something from the Sefer HaChinuch, which you might say is a surprising source, because the Sefer HaChinuch is not known for being Kabbalistically inclined or mystically inclined. And you might say that sort of this divide between those poskim who hold that tzaddikim don't impart tumah and do impart tumah is, I don't know if 100% neatly, but more or less going to come down the divide between those who are more mystically inclined and those who are more, I don't know, maybe you would call it rationalist inclined. But so the Sefer HaChinuch, that's why to me the Sefer HaChinuch is a very interesting source on this topic. The Ramban writes, I have the source somewhere here on the page, and I'll probably get to it. I'll find it soon. But he says, no, you can't say that Eliyahu Novi was just being flippant. Here it is. Yeah, he writes, you can't say that Eliyahu was just being flippant. Chas v'shalom. Can't say he was just being flippant, because then he would be nois and michshel if he would be stumbling people who would read the statements of Eliyahu Navi and think that he means it literally, that tzaddikim and that non-Jews don't impart tumah. So the truth is the Ramban is explicitly talking about the non-Jews. He's not talking about if I recall correctly, about the tzaddikim, but the same logic could apply. Although you could say that the story about tzaddikim is in the Medrash, not in the Gemara, which is more of a halachic work. Okay, that's already getting a little bit too into splitting the hairs. The point is that the Ramban seems to be uncomfortable with this idea that Eliyahu Navi is making a statement, and we're saying no, he doesn't really mean it. Like if he says that tzaddikim don't impart tumah, he means that tzaddikim don't impart tumah. So why would it be that tzaddikim don't impart tumah? So let's read from Rabbeinu Bechaya's commentary to his introduction to Parshas Amr, and it's quite long, so let me just pick out the relevant lines. He's talking here about the concept of neshika, of a kiss, and we know that by certain tzaddikim, we find it by Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron, etc., that there's this idea that they passed away with a kiss from Hashem. Misas neshika, it comes up in Rashi a number of times in Chumash. So he says,
it's like the best way to die.
The best, yeah. So what does it mean? So that, one second. Then he says, also Rabbeinu HaKadosh, that's Rabbi, when he died, he did not die through the Malach HaMashchus, so he didn't have the destructive angel coming to take his life, which maybe synonymous with Malach HaMaves. So most people, in other words, Misas Neshika dying through the kiss is sort of the contrast is the typical way of dying is the Malach HaMaves comes, or what he calls the Malach HaMashchis, and the angel of death. And then, but Moshe Rabbeinu, he comes through the kiss from Hashem, right? And he says, similarly we find by Rabbi, who when he died, he raised up his 10 fingers and he says that, God, you know that I've never benefited, never had any pleasure from this world at all. So, and so there should be peace in my rest, meaning peace in my passing away, I guess. And the heavenly voice emerged and announced, Yaveh Shalom Yanuach Al Mishkaveh. The peace should come and he should rest in peace. So that's why, says Rabbeinu Bechaya, when Rabbi died, there was no tumah, and Kohanim were allowed to be preoccupied in preparing in his burial, because the reason why a corpse imparts tumah is because because he dies through the Malach HaMashchis. When the angel of death comes to take the neshama, that is a force of impurity, and it's the sort of residue of that impurity that imparts tumas meis. But if somebody dies in the way of misas neshikin, so then there's no impurity, and they don't impart any tumah. Okay? Now again, not so surprising to see that from Rabbeinu Bechaya, who certainly very much embraces and is part of the Kabbalistic school.
But
however, yes?
How many people actually experience Misa Neshika? I thought it was like Moshe Rabbeinu,
so
maybe Aaron.
Well, he's applying that to Rebbe. The question, in other words, there's going to be what Ari's saying, and let me just paraphrase what you're saying and tell me if you agree. What Ari, I think what an important point to be made, and I think that poskim do make this, is that even if you accept the argument in the theory that tzadikim don't impart tumah ever, not during their funeral or not any other time, is nasatid v'rechel l'shurin, like who's going to decide which tzaddik had the appropriate type of death, and didn't, like we don't know these things. So if Moshe Rabbeinu, those who have clear statements in Chazal that they died in the Misas Neshika, or Rabbi who has this whole story in the Gemara, which Rabbeinu Bechaya understands that to be Misas Neshika.
Didn't he suffer at the end in his life? He was the one that.
Good. So
he had a very difficult death, right? Or at least
he had a very difficult
life.
life. He was healed after. Okay, I don't remember exactly.
That was with the story with his.
Yeah, but I don't remember. Didn't he get healed and then die, or he died straight from there? I don't remember.
She basically effectuated that his soul finally left.
Yeah. God, so Rabbeinu Bechaya would obviously hold that the suffering is not. That's
before the death, and that was like then finally he had some mercy on him, and then he died in Misas Neshika.
Yeah, according to him, I guess Misas Neshika wouldn't be something that's observable to it's not a physical phenomena. So in other words, there would be poskim who would say, look, in theory it's true, but in practice we can't apply this because we don't know which tzadikim to apply it to. We'll see later the Avnei Nezer brings. So the Avnei Nezer is a tremendous going, Chassidish Rebbe and a Pesach, and he, at least in theory, did accept this. And he writes that he says that it depends. That if somebody was killed, so then it doesn't come through the Malach HaMavis. I think he said that's why Rabbi Kiva was killed, so he doesn't have this impurity from the Malach HaMavis, and that's why it was okay for him. Versus Tzadikim who died a natural death, then maybe not. So I don't know if that's the opposite of Rabbeinu Bechaya, if somehow we could synthesize between them. But the Avnei Nezer himself, in practice, did not allow it. There's a story that he was around with one of the Gerer Rebbes who passed away or something, and he was absolutely no Kohanim may not come close. So again, he accepted it in theory, but not in practice. And I think that part of the reason why some people may not have accepted it in practice is again because it's a slippery slope. Was where do you draw the line? I mean, if you take the literal language from the Yalkut Shimoni, it says the Torah scholars and even their students. So, I mean, anybody who studies Torah, I mean, it's, Okay.
There's also, if you're basing it on this philosophical construct that when a person dies in Misas Neshika, it's not the Malach HaMaves, right? But how you determine whether that person is experiencing Misas Neshika, considering what we just said about Rabbi. Rabbi, we know, he suffered until the end. And then we're still saying that it was Misas Neshika. So, I don't know. I mean, the moment of death was Misas Neshika. How do I know whether that happened or not?
Well, possibly the assumption would be that anybody who's a tzaddik has a Misas Neshika. But then, how do you know who's a tzaddik?
Right. Yes, so, right. That also is.
And also, it's true. It's also true that we know explicitly that the Malach HaMavis is invoked in the death of tzaddikim, like the story of Rabbi Bar Nachmani, who the Malach HaMavis couldn't get him until he rustled and he disturbed him from his learning, and then he was able to get him. Right? Yeah. My son asked me a couple of weeks ago, like, what happens if somebody will take a gun and shoot somebody, but the Malach HaMavis doesn't come, so will he die or not? Right, so it's like, it's not. We're not used to thinking of the Malach HaMavis as being sort of a physical. Okay, let me read to you the Sefer HaChinuch again. Sefer HaChinuch to me is very interesting because he's not usually sort of so mystically inclined, but he's talking here in the beginning of Parshas Amar. It's mitzvah Reish Samech Gimel. That's mitzvah 263, where it's the prohibition for a kohen to come in contact with the dead. He writes like this: Mishosha mitzvah from the reasons of the mitzvah, which is what the Chinuch always does. He always goes into the reasons for the mitzvah. Lefisha kohenim nivchru l'avodas Hashem baruch hu. Kohenim have been selected to serve Hashem. K'moshe Amar HaKosov Kadosh Mi'Elokeim, as the pasuk says, they are holy to their God. Al kein irchika min hames. Therefore, the Torah tells them to remain distant from the dead. I've already explained to you above previously that Tumah is something despised. And the sages explain to us that the corpse itself is avia avoisa tuma. That's the most severe form of impurity, meaning that it has a very, very strong type of impurity. Worse than any, or more impure than any other impurity. Why so? When the tzuras haseichel, which I'm not expert, I'm not familiar with the chinuch's philosophy on exactly the neshama and the seichel and the this and the that, but I would loosely translate tzuras haseichel as the neshama. So when the neshama departs from the body and the body remains in and of itself, the body itself is just a lowly piece of flesh which yearns for bad stuff, it's just indulgence. And with the body's great yearning for indulgence, he made the neshama sin, while the neshama was still in the body. Therefore, it makes sense that the body should make impure everything that's around him. When the neshama, which is its entire glory, leaves it, and all that remains is the bad form of the body, so obviously it makes sense that it should impart tumah. And that's why it makes sense that those who are the servants of Hashem, namely the Kohanim, should remain distant from the corpse, with the exception of relatives for whom it's permissible for the Kohen to come in contact with because the brother is the flesh. Look, the Torah gives us pleasant laws. The Torah doesn't want to withhold the opportunity from the Kohanim to be able to mourn and to go and stand next to the body of their relative and mourn. So we make this allowance for them to come in contact with the corpse if it's a relative of theirs. But beyond that, other than a relative, it's only logical that a Kohen should not be allowed to come in contact with the dead. Now, the chinuch, when he gives the reasons for the mitzvahs, in most cases, like in this case, there's no source in Chazal for this. He himself is trying to come up with a good reason. And then he says, however, this reason that I've just told you as being the reason why Kohanim don't come in contact with the dead, I see a source, or at least an allusion to this in Chazal. Chazal state, and he doesn't give a source for this, but I would presume that this is the medrash of Eliyahu Navi burying Rabbi Akiva. Chazal say that Tzadikim Gemurim, and here he adds in the words that the complete righteous, those who are completely righteous, don't impart tumah. And I think that the reason is because their body is pure and clean. The body of those who are completely righteous did not make them sin and pull them towards indulgence and temptation. And therefore they die with this neshika. In other words, that fits with Rabbeinu Bechai, that the idea of dying with neshika comes together with not having indulged in tumah, which is what he says about Rabbi, that Rabbi didn't derive any pleasure from worldliness, which is possibly even a euphemism for sexual indulgence. So that fits very nicely. These two, the Sefer Chinuch with Rabbeinu Bechaya. I'll give them yishkoin. I guess that means on their body there is always the holy light is resting. Okay, Akapadim, we see from here this idea worded both in more mystical and in more, I will say, relatable terminology, maybe, that a tzaddik's the body of a tzaddik is inherently different than the body of a regular person, and therefore the death of a tzaddik is kind of a different process than the death of a regular person, and therefore it does not impart tumah. Now, we've already seen, so what do we see so far? Again, we see the opinion of, let's call it the stam opinion of Tosfos that tzadikim do impart tumah, and then there's the opinion of Rabbi Chaim Kai. Now, within this, opinion of Reb Chaim Cohen. So some understand it to mean that to attend the funeral, not that the tzaddik doesn't impart tumah, that you could go and hang out by the or pray or whatever at the grave of a tzaddik, but they could attend the funeral. Now, what would be the reason to attend the kvura? So one understanding would be, and this fits actually with the Rambam as well, that we said before the concept of a mes mitzvah. What does a mes mitzvah mean? Mes mitzvah means a dead person, a body who we don't have. There's no people around to tend to the burial needs of this person. So then, is a mes mitzvah and a kohen can do. A nasi. Now, a nasi in halachic vernacular could mean a couple of things. In certain cases, nasi means literally the king, but nasi is also extended to the leader. L'chayra, on a strict halachic basis, a nasi would have to be somebody who actually has authority or political power or something. Again, I'm not completely clear in all the details of exactly what the definition of a nasi is, but the office of the nasi doesn't exist anymore and hasn't existed already for many years. But Rabbi was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbeinu HaKadosh. He was the nasi, so he wasn't the literal king in the sense like David HaMelech was the king, but he was the nasi, right? So the Rambam writes that it's mutter for kohen to l'tami l'nasi Yisrael, to coming impure by coming to the funeral of a nasi Yisrael. I don't know if the Rambam would apply this to Rabbeinu HaKadosh or only to an actual king, possibly only to an actual king. Because everybody is obligated to honor the tzaddik. So in other words, to the nasi. In other words, what that means is, just like with a mes mitzvah, you need two people to bury him. So if there's no people around, then the kohen is allowed to go and preoccupy himself with the burial. The nasi needs everyone. However many people are at the funeral, it's not enough. The nasi, the dignity of the office of the nasi dictates that there should be, that all Jews should be at the funeral, and therefore, even if all the non-Kohanim are there, it's still not enough. It's kind of comparable in some way to a mes mitzvah that the Kohanim are allowed to go. So it's not. We're not saying that he's a tzaddik and he doesn't impart tumah. We're saying that as the nasi, his funeral overrides tumah. Right? That seems to be one way of understanding the one moment. Now, how does this? How could this make it? What's this got to do with Rabbeinu Chaim Cohen? So the Beis Yosef says in Yerodeh Siman Shenayin Daled, which is in the laws of mourning, where the Shulchan Aruch discusses this, he says Shema Yosef Rabbi Chaim the Gadol Hadoir Dina Kanosi. Maybe Rabbeinu Chaim Cohen believed that the Gadol Hadoir, which again, like you said before, it's a little bit of a Nosachtas Rechad Yishurin. How do you determine who is the Gadol Hadoir? But Rabbi Chaim Cohen is determining that Rabbeinu Tam was the Gadol Hadoir. So the Gadol Hadoir has a din of a nasi. So the reason why Rabbi Chaim Cohen is saying that he would have gone to the funeral of Rabbeinu Tam is not because Rabbeinu Tam doesn't impart tumah, but because Rabbeinu Tam's funeral is this funeral where everybody has to go, and if there's not everybody there, then it's like a mas mitzvah, and the Kohen is allowed to go.
So an average mace, if you're passing by and you're the only one that can make sure this person receives a proper burial, that's analogized to not having a great amount of people, a large quantity of people at the funeral of somebody. And yes, and there's no large quantity that's enough. If there's any Jews who are not there, then it's not enough. Right. Wow.
Now, it's a tremendous chiddush to say that you have 7,000 people at the funeral, but there's a kohen standing on the side. We need 7,001, right? But on the other hand, it's sort of a halachic construct that I think, in the halachic norms, it's much more easy to deal with than to say that because somebody was a tzaddik, we're suspending all the laws of Tumah and Tara. It's a much bigger chiddush, right?
Well, the point is, a lot of people were there, but Yankel wasn't.
It's not about 7.
Yankel the Kohen.
Yes, Steve.
Just to clarify a little something about Tumah. So a tzaddik, we're talking about a tzaddik passes away and does the body give off tumah? Does the body tumah? Okay. A tzaddik, while he's alive, still can accumulate tumah.
Yes, yeah. There's a different type of tumah. There's all sorts of tumahs.
Oh, okay, all right. So, okay.
But you're asking, even that's even saying tumahs mace. In other words, you're asking if a tzaddik were to go into the into the let's say the same building as a dead body, would the tzaddik become tamei?
Okay, that's where I'm going with the question.
Yeah.
So let's say the tzaddik gets into a position where he becomes tumei. Let's say, I don't know, he has a seminal mission or something. And then before he can go purify himself, he dies. Okay, so he's in a state of tuma. I don't know the levels of tuma, but he's in a state of tuma when he dies, but he's a tzaddik. Does the death then cancel that tuma and he can't?
Well, the death of any... I like where you're going in general, but in the specific detail of the way you sort of... In other words, the general concept is like, 1 second, if a tzaddik doesn't impart tumah when he dies, then how could he contract tumah when he's alive? But specifically in the specific example you gave, I would say that anybody who dies, the death cancels out the tumah's carry, because the tumah from a seminal emission is a tumah that a live person can have. As soon as he dies, the fact that he had a seminal emission is irrelevant. I mean, in other words,
look what you just said. Then you said that anyone who dies, all the tumah is canceled. So,
but it's canceled because it's not the laws of at least the way I see it. I could be wrong, but the way I see the laws of tumah and tara, they're halachic constructs that have no relevance to a dead body. In other words, what do you mean? A guy who's a tumas, he has a seminal emission. So now what? So now he's not allowed to go into the Beis Hamikdash. So yeah. So Lamashal, by me, I don't know if I could prove this, but to me it would be. I'm fairly certain that if a person has a seminal emission, he's not allowed to go into the Harabayas, and now he drops dead. You would be allowed to take the corpse into the Harabayas. Yes, I believe that's. I think that's. I would say that once he dies, that's it. He's not a person. According to halacha, when a person dies, it's not a human being anymore. It's a body. It's two different things, right? Even and there's other things also. Again, I don't want to get too grotesque over here, but for example, there's forbidden relations. A person is not allowed to have relations with a relative of his, right? If a person were to have relations with the corpse of a relative of his, that would be disgusting, and it would probably be a violation of a number of other things, but it wouldn't be a violation of incest, right? Because a dead person is not a person. It's a different thing. Anyway, but good point. I like the general. That was very nice. Okay.
Now he's no longer a being that receives tuma, but now he's just he's in essence now become a vehicle that can transmit tuma only. Right.
Yeah. But a dead body you're allowed to bring in the Harabayas, and a carry is not, right? So it's not such the hierarchy is not 100% of a binary. Okay. Okay, so again, so far we have the opinion of the Stoma of Tosfos that says no exceptions for Tzadikim's Tumah. Then we have one interpretation of Reb Chaim Kohen that says that the exception is not that the Tzadik doesn't impart Tumah, but that the Tumah is overridden for that day so that everybody could attend the funeral. And whereas some would say that only applies to the Nasi, the Chiddush of the novelty of Reb Chaim Kohen is that it applies even to the Gadol Hador. However, if you are to take going back to the Medrash of Eliyahu Navi with the burying Rabbi Kiva and saying that Tzadikim don't impart Tumah at all, so then it wouldn't just apply during the burial, it would apply even to go to the grave of the righteous, right? And for example, there's a number of Sfarim that record, Ne'esaschar is one of them, but it's recorded in a number of Sfarim, that there was, at least in some times, in some places, a prevalent custom that Kohanim did go to pray at the graves of the righteous, and there was this understanding that the graves of the righteous are different than all other graves. Now, the truth is that, as Tosfos mentioned, it's possible that many graves only impart tumah midrabanan. If there's a tefach in between of space or not, and there's numerous shittas about that. I'm not going to get into all of that, but there is already, in other words, it's possible to say that this prevalent custom, which existed in some places, that Kohanim went to the graves of Tzadikim, was also taking into account the fact that perhaps the grave is constructed in a way that it doesn't impart tumah, at least not on a biblical level. Now,
so you're layering the factors that would permit it.
Right. There's other records for this. I quoted the Bnei Yissaschar. There's there's a tshuva from the Batik Huna, which is Rabbi in Rapoport, where he says that I've seen people go to Kivrei Tzadikim. I be quiet. I allow them to rely on whatever they're relying, but I don't accept this. This is not okay. You shouldn't go. He's not thing. In the Sefer Eshkol as a Rishon, he says you cannot rely on this medrash with Rabbi Kiva and Eliyahu Novi because we don't paskin halacha based on the medrash. It's not something that's quoted in the Gemara, and therefore it doesn't have. It's important in the realm of medrash, but in the realm of practical halacha, we don't follow this. Now. By the way, he brings a good word. The Divrei Yatziv, that's a Kloisenberger Rebbe, he suggests that there's a Gemara, which is perhaps famous, that Tzadikim after misasim kriyim chayim. That says that Tzadikim, even when they're alive, after they're passing, they're still referred to as alive. Says the Divrei Yatziv, why they're referred to as alive? Because they don't impart tumah. Yeah, it's an interesting comment. Okay, now, do we have any clear proofs from the Gemara that tzaddikim do impart tumah? So seems to be a number of relevant gemaras. First of all, we were talking yesterday about Pesach Sheni. So who were the people who were tamei and couldn't bring Pesach Sheni? So there's two opinions in the Gemara. One opinion is that those were the people who were carrying the coffin of Yosef, and another is that it was Mishal and Al-Tzafan who were carrying the bodies of Nadav and Avihu. But whichever one of those two opinions, right, both Yosef and Nadav and Avihu were, certainly Yosef, Nadav and Avihu, perhaps we could, there's different opinions, but certainly Yosef is a tremendous tzaddik. So how could you say that the body of the righteous doesn't impart tumah when the Gemara says that those who were carrying the coffin of Yosef could not bring the Karban Pesach? Additionally, we have a Gemara in Bava Metzia, Pehei Amid Beis, 85b, that Rish Lakish, and there's a number of Gemaras along these lines that different Amiroyim were busy being Metzai and Marta. They were making clear signage or postage of where the graves of tzaddikim were, so the implication seems to be that the reason they were doing this was to make sure to there's a sign here, Kohanim, you better avoid this path, go on that path, because here there's a grave of a tzaddik. And
why would you only be marking the graves of tzaddikim then?
Well, the story is okay. So Rish Lakish is Mitzay Marta Shal Rabbanon, and Rashi says he says Shal Rabbanon. Right, he's talking about the graves of the rabbis, and then there's Rabbi Noah who was Mitzay in the grave of Adam Rishon and Avraham Avinu. Right, so and even though Goyim don't impart tumah, Adam Rishon and Avraham Avinu are an exception, as this explains over there. Okay, fine. So says the Maril that you see from here that tzaddikim do impart tumah, because that the people who were in contact with Yosef and Nadav and Avihu did impart tumah, and also Avraham Avinu, who could be a greater tzaddik than Avraham Avinu and Adam Rishon. Why was Rabbi Noah marking the grave of Avraham Avinu and Adam Rishon? These are tremendous holy people. It must be because they don't impart tumah. Now, however, says what would be some ways to justify? In other words, those who hold that tzaddikim don't impart tumah, so how would they understand these gemaras? So first of all, it could be that the reason why the Maris and Machpelah imparted tumah was because we know that Esav's head was also there. So not because of Adam and not because of Avraham, but Esav's head was imparting tumah.
It's a full aver.
Yeah, that's what. And also it could be the fact that in general they were being Mitzay and Marta of tzaddikim was not so that the Kohanim should avoid it, but that people should know where the tzaddikim is buried, so they should be able to go and daven in those places.
So I was saying it's dafka kivrei tzaddikim. I mean, you should be concerned about all corpses.
Right. And anyway, so we find also Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes that the reason was so that people should become and daven over there, and and then there's also Yosef and Mishal and Al-Tzafan. So here we have the Avnei Nezer actually writes, I quoted this before, that Rabbi Kiva was killed, and that's why he wasn't Matame. But Yosef, who died a natural death, he would have been Matame, and he explains the whole thing based on the Zohar. that there's 3 drops from the Malach HaMavis. Again, the whole long thing, but the Etish al-Nachash. But basically, he wants to be mechalik between Rabbi Kiva, who was killed, and he does not impart Tumah, versus Yosef, who died a natural death. But as I said before, Lamaisa, the Nezer. Well, I guess it would fit with his thing of a natural death. But Lamaisa, he did not allow people to attend, Kohanim to attend the funeral of Tzadikim who died. Now, okay, so B'kitza, that's the bottom line. We have this machlokas, 3-way machlokas. One way is that no different tzaddikim from everyone else. Another one is that tzaddikim, you could go to the funeral because it's like a mass mitzvah, but that's it. And then there's this third opinion, which is the novel opinion, very novel opinion, that tzaddikim don't impart tumah. Now, there was a very great Sephardi posek named Rabbi Shlomo Eliezer Alefandri, I believe, who at the end of his life at least lived in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim. He lived a very, very old age. I think, according to some accounts, even over 120, but certainly over 100. And so he writes like this. He says, we can make a sfek sveika. He says, that the Ravid holds that Kohanim nowadays are already, everybody nowadays is assumed to already be Tamei Mas, to already be not impure. We spoke about this a little bit. We spoke about this Ravid a little bit when we spoke about Para Aduma and the possibility of renewing Para Aduma nowadays. So this Ravid features prominently in that discussion. So the Ravid is of the opinion that a Kohen who's already Tamei does no longer have a prohibition to further become Tamei. So according to the Rabbi, there would be no prohibition nowadays for a Kohen to go to a cemetery. Major qualification. The normative way of understanding the Rabbi is that there wouldn't be a biblical prohibition to go for a Kohen nowadays. He would agree that there's a rabbinic prohibition. Right? But, so Rav Alefandri wants to make, he's known as the Sabba Kadisha, Shaz Chuvas HaSabba Kadisha, he wants to make a sfek sveika. He says, look, it's possible that tzadikim's graves don't impart tumah, because that's one opinion. And it's also possible that the opinion of the Ravid is correct, that a kohen nowadays is allowed to come in contact with the dead. So putting all that together, we should allow kohenim to go to the graves of the righteous. Again, as you can imagine, there's a lot of stretch over there. First of all, the Ravid will also hold it's rabbinically forbidden. And second of all, these are, it's not just like this 50-50, some opinions say this and some opinions say that. The vast majority of opinions is that the Kohanim are not allowed to come in contact with the corpse now, even nowadays. The vast majority opinion is that tzadikim do impart tumah. So it's nice in theory, but in practice it's difficult to say. Also, there's a Dogel Meirvava, the Noid Yehuda, who also wanted to rely on a sfek sveika, on such a type of sfek sveika in regard to something. One second. He wanted, I forgot exactly what the case is. Rabbi Yehuda wanted to sort of make this double suffix, that maybe the halach is like the Ravid, and maybe, I think Rabbi Yehuda is talking about going to the grave of a goy, to being by the grave of a goy, and he says, at the end he says, no, we can't really use this sfek sveika because, here it is. Yeah, he basically wants to say that we should be lenient about coming close to the grave of a goy because of this sfek sveika. Maybe a goy doesn't impart tumah, and maybe a kohen is allowed to come to me. But then he says no, he doesn't like this. He's not comfortable with it in the end. These lenient opinions are very difficult, and the sugyas don't fit nicely with each other. These are very deep matters. I'm not able to, the margins of my page cannot contain them. But I've retracted my heter for a kohen to go by the grave of a goy. Okay? Now, there may be other possibilities of being lenient. Kohenei chazaka. The question is, to what extent do we have absolute certainty that kohenim nowadays are for sure kohenim? I want to finish off like I mentioned, there's many more, much more to say about this. I'm just giving a sort of overview of the topic. Welcome to our in-house Kohen. As we finish off over here, that the opinion of the Rebbe. So the Rebbe has a couple of letters about this. There's a book called Ashkav to the Rebbe. Ashkav to the Rebbe was written by Rabbi Rivkin, who was with the Rebbe Rashab in his last days and also in the burial. And he writes there that all the Kohanim participated in the Torah and the burial. There was no thing. But, he says, I'm sure they all had well intentions, but I'm not so sure it was a good idea. But then he says that and the Rebbe writes about this in a letter, that when they constructed the Ohel in 1951 around the grave of the Frierdiker Rebbe, which today is the Ohel around the grave of the Rebbe as well. So I mentioned this yesterday, that traditionally, if you look around the world, and I didn't have time to sort of research exactly the history of this custom, but the fact is that all around the world, they have Ohalim, they have structures over the grave of Tzadikim, and it's always a proper structure. An Ohel literally means a tent, right? It's a structure, it's a house, it's a building, right? From what I've seen, again, I'm not the hugest expert, from what I've seen, one of the only exceptions is the Ohel of the Rabbeim, of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe, which is not, it's just a wall. There's no ceiling, right? It's just open to the sky. Not only that, it also has a wall around the actual grave, which is more than 10 tefachim tall. And the Rebbe specifically constructed it in that way because the Rebbe wanted Kohanim to be able to go to the Frierdiker Rebbe's Ohel. So he made it in a way where there's no roof, so you don't have the problem of Ohel HaTumah, so that's, you're not under the same roof as the dead. And also there's a wall around it, so even though a Kohen is not allowed to come within 4 amos of a dead body, but if there's a wall that's 10 tefachim, that cuts it off. And so the Rebbe writes that even though there are opinions that Tzadikim grave don't impart Tumah, and the Rebbe quotes all the sources and the references, but at the end of the day, the Rebbe says, we don't accept that, practically speaking, and therefore we constructed the oil in such a way, and Kohanim could drive up. This is before it was the way it was today. The way it was then, Kohanim could drive with a car down the street of the cemetery, and within the closed car, that's not a problem. And then you open the door and go straight into the oil, and that's why the oil was designed in that way. And in his Sefer, in Ashkaf to the Rebbe, Beryl Rivkin sort of says, that's very good the way they're doing it here in New York. The Rebbe quotes also the Alter Rebbe's brother about how they built the oil in Haditch of the Alter Rebbe. That doesn't, again, I don't know the details, but the Rebbe is basically saying that the Maharil did not hold of this heter for Kohanim to go. So in practice, the Rebbe did not accept the heter, and the Rebbe specifically constructed the oil in an unusual way, specifically to allow for our Kohen friends to go there. I should add, I don't know what to make of this very much. Again, it could be topic for further discussion. But just l'shleimus inyan, I should add that there is, and I don't remember the details, I didn't look it up to date, so I'm with a disclaimer that I'm relying on my memory of quite a number of years ago, that the Rebbe was once at Nichum Avelim for somebody, I forget who, some Rebbe, maybe Satmar Rebbe, somebody, no. I remember one of the Rebbes who lived in New York, and the Rebbe went to be Menachem Ovel, and or as we say in America, pay a shiva call, and the Rebbe, I think that Rebbe's assistant, his Gabbai, was a Kohen, and something like the Rebbe asked him if he went with, and the Rebbe sort of made some sort of comment to the effect of, you should have gone and asked questions later. So again, I don't remember the exact details, and I don't know how much you can take out halacha l'maisa from some conversation of the Rebbe that's, it's not muga, it's not edited, somebody may have misheard something and recorded it wrong. It's certainly not something that has any halachic weight, but I guess it seems like the Rebbe really wanted to accommodate for Kohanim, and the Rebbe was saying, just the Kohen has to be allowed to be there, and therefore the Rebbe constructed the oil specifically in that way, and nobody could have any shilas. In other words, had the oil been constructed in another way, so then, I don't know, but the Rebbe specifically made sure Again, I'm hesitant about this. I just wanted to mention it because I think it's an important sort of in the Chabad discussion. It's an important source to mention. But clearly, in the Rebbe's letter, it's very explicit that he does not at all accept the heter for tzadikim, for Kohanim to go to the graves of the righteous, and therefore designed and constructed the oil specifically in that way.
Isn't there a problem with like the Kohanim going through a non-Jewish cemetery and the fact that it's just littered with, crosses and all sorts of idolatry? So,
Well, I don't know that there's a specific prohibition to go near a cross, and if there is, it wouldn't be more for a Kohen than for anybody else.
well, I'm saying that too.
Yeah, so there's no. I mean, you're not supposed to go into a church, which is you're not to go into a house of worship of Avodah Zarah, but to go somewhere. I mean, I can understand that it's not comfortable or not pleasant, but there's no strict halachic prohibition against walking past the cross.
In Muncie, what's the name of
The
it?
Ribnitzer Rebbe.
I think it's called the Good Samaritan.
The Church of the Good Samaritan.
No, the hospital.
Oh, the hospital.
I
Well,
think
you
it's
got
Good
the hospital.
Good Samaritan Hospital, I think.
Yeah.
And it's very Catholic, and but it's very commonly used hospital for frum people in Muncie area. And when they go to the hospital, there's like crosses up in the rooms, and
Yeah.
they
Saint
take the
Francis,
crosses
right?
down.
St. Francis.
Oh, they
Yeah,
take
the same
front-
way.
St.
Well,
Francis
they take
is
them
the
down.
same way.
A lot of the frum will take it down, and
Oh.
and a lot of the staff there are Catholic, and sometimes there's nuns that work there, and they're very bothered because they put them in the bedpans.
Oh.
And they complained to my mother they're taking our religious symbols and putting them in bedpans.
Well, it still
My
leaves
mother's
the
like,
image.
I'm